Welcome to the City of the Dead.
Lucio Fulci made his first out-and-out overt horror film in 1979, Zombie Flesh Eaters, and this was a big hit. I mean, this came out in August of 1979 in Rome, and came out in January of 1980 in the USA, and February of 1980 in the UK. I'm not sure when it came out in Japan, but it was a big hit in Japan as well. Essentially, this was a fairly low-budget horror movie, his first out-and-out horror film, but it was pretty much a smash hit, really, internationally.
Whatever it is, it makes the dead stand up and walk.
Now, both Lucio and Dardano Sacchetti, the writer of Zombie Flesh Eaters, both expected that when the film was so successful, that there would be lots of, there'd be a clamour of offers made, that the telephone would never stop ringing, and they would have lots of new producers wanting to work with them. Sacchetti in particular says, oh, well, this was strange, it never actually happened. We didn't actually find that was the case. Looking at the dates for what happened next, though, it seems like the wait wasn't such a long wait, because in December of 1979, which is only 4 months after Zombie Flesh Eaters, Lucio got another project off the ground called Luca il Contrabbandiere, or The Smuggler, which is not a horror film, that's a crime thriller, a very violent crime thriller. And then in April of 1980, the project that we're talking about today, City of the Living Dead, came about. I think it was first announced to the press, first announced to Variety in April of 1980, and it was in production by June, July of 1980. So unless you've got very high expectations of instant work, then I suppose it's not too bad to say Lucio had actually made 2 films within a year of making Zombie Flesh Eaters. What's interesting, though, is that Zombie Flesh Eaters was produced by Fabrizio De Angelis. And you might have thought that the producer of Zombie Flesh Eaters, such a big, successful film, would immediately want to reconvene, get the director back, make another film, get the writer and everyone and pile in and make another one. Seems a little strange to me that actually didn't happen. What actually happened is that Fabrizio De Angelis took note of the Italian success of Zombie Flesh Eaters, Zombie 2 in Italy, and quickly wrote a script treatment for a different director, Marino Girolami, and rushed another production before the cameras called Zombie Holocaust, or I think it was actually called Queen of the Cannibals or something like that when it was first put together. But essentially, De Angelis, rather than thinking, oh, Lucio's just directed me a winner, let's get him in to do another one, thought, well, let's make another zombie film, but with someone else. And it wasn't until December of 1980, which is about 18 months later, that De Angelis and Fulci came back together again to make a film, and that film was The Beyond.
Woe be unto him who opens one of the 7 gateways to hell, because through that gateway, evil will invade the world.
So who were the producers of City of the Living Dead? Well, given that Fabrizio De Angelis decided not to take Fulci on and make another movie in the same style, Fulci was approached by a different company entirely. He was approached by a company called National Cinematografica in co-production with another company called Darnia Film. Now, I think National were run by a guy called Mino Loy, and Darnia were run by Luciano Martino, who was Sergio Martino's brother. Those two appear to be the executive producers on the film, and those were the main 2 companies. And then I think towards the end, Medusa Distribuzione came in with extra money at some point as well. So the production credits for City of the Living Dead name all 3 of those companies. As far as I can tell, I think Mino Loy was the first person as a producer that was attached to City, and that was in a news story in Variety, I think in April of 1980, when the project was called The Fear. That was the title that was mentioned in Variety. Whether or not that was just the Italian correspondent for Variety helpfully translating the Italian, I don't know. But anyway, the first title that it was ever talked about under was The Fear. And of course, in Italy, when the film came out, it came out as Paura nella città dei morti viventi, which means fear in the city of the living dead. So between April and July, pre-production was in place, and eventually around June or July, Lucio and his film crew went over to America and started shooting, first of all in America and then back to Rome to shoot the interiors and a few other pickup shots in Rome. The first stop, I believe, was in New York. There's a lot of material shot in the early stages of the film in New York. You see Christopher George going to the house where the seance had happened. I think that's on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, on West 76th Street. And if you go to Google Maps even today, you'll see that the outside of the building looks pretty much identical. And you also see some material, as I'm sure you'll all remember very well, in the cemetery where Catriona MacColl's character Mary is buried alive and rescued by Christopher George's character Peter. It's a bit hard to pin down where that cemetery is. I have tried, and the closest I can get is that it looks like it was probably this place called Calvary Cemetery, or if failing that, it was one called Mount Zion Cemetery, and they're both very close together with a similar view over the water towards Manhattan. But I'm not sure which of the two it is. But yes, all of the New York shooting took place first. And then after shooting in New York, the crew left New York and did a few pickup shots on the way just to show the characters, Peter and Mary, en route to Dunwich. And Dunwich itself, the town where the latter half of the film, where a great deal of the supernatural action takes place, is actually Savannah in Georgia, which is down in the southern states of the USA. Now, City of the Living Dead is the first film that Catriona MacColl made with Lucio Fulci, and she went on to make The Beyond and House by the Cemetery, 3 films very closely interlinked in style and generally in the whole feel of the films. They feel very much cut from the same cloth. What's kind of amusing if you love those films is that Catriona's character, she's always the innocent in these stories, and she's always suffering these terrible situations that deteriorate as the film goes along. And it's almost like she's on some strange kind of karmic wheel where she lives one life that gets sucked into nightmare and horror, and then she kind of pops up again at the beginning of another film that feels almost the same world and lives another life that gets sucked into horror as well. So she's somehow kind of caught on this kind of circular sort of descent into hell, into the maelstrom. Catriona, beautiful actress, very, very composed, beautiful diction.
Yes, that's it.
She's got a great deal of poise and a great deal of elegance, I think, as a person. And she brings all those things to the films, which is one of the components that helps to balance out the horror.
I saw a priest who, by hanging himself, opened the gates of hell.
I think with all of these films, the City of the Living Dead, The Beyond, House by the Cemetery, there's this balancing act between elegance on the one hand and disgust and repulsion and horror on the other. And certainly Catriona's contribution is very much in the former category, of course. She first met Lucio at some sort of palatial residence, I believe, belonging to her Roman agent, who lived very much the high life. And she and Lucio were first introduced in this extremely lavish interior. Apparently Lucio was on his best behaviour. He was, charming, reserved even, which might seem a little hard to fathom, but Catriona said that she had no indication at that early stage that he had a temper. And nor really, I don't think, during the making of the films, did she particularly herself see the worst of his temper either. I believe she speculated on one interview that I saw where she speculated that he seemed to have a greater respect for Anglo-Saxon performers. So it's probably the Italians that got the worst of it, really. Whereas when he had visiting Americans or visiting British actors, he tended to be a lot more polite with them.
Doesn't seem to have been any kind of physical abuse.
One of the standout supporting roles in the film, in fact, it's probably so prominent it's not really a supporting role, it's probably the third lead, is Giovanni Lombardo Radici playing Bob. Apparently this was a role that was going to go to Michele Soavi, who is in the film, is playing one of the victims in the gut-barfing scene. He's the boyfriend in that amazing scene. And of course, I'm sure you all know, Michele Soavi became a director in his own right and a very, very wonderful director of films like Stage Fright and The Church and The Sect and Della Morte dell'Amore. But yes, Giovanni Lombardo Radici was given the role instead of Michele. And apparently he got on very well with Lucio as well. It's interesting to see interviews with actors and see how... you see many interviews with people who say, well, he could be terrible with people, he's always very nice with me. So, one of these days we'll find somebody who's willing to talk who says, no, I was the person he was being a real bastard with, so. But apparently Radici got on fine with him, said that At one point, the idea had been that Bob would be a hunchback, and Lucio had initially wanted Giovanni to wear a hump, kind of a prosthetic hump. And Giovanni had said, I really don't want to go down the Quasimodo route. Can't I just do this with my bodily stance, rather than using a prosthetic? And I mean, that sounds like the kind of thing that Lucio would have hit the roof over, an actor wanting to challenge him on something like that. But no, he said, sure, if you want to do that, great. So yes, when you watch Bob in City of the Living Dead, bear in mind that he was originally going to be a little bit more Andy Milligan, with a major deformity, but that was written out before it hit the cameras. One of the really curious things about City of the Living Dead, and I think one of the things that gives it its special sort of power and strangeness, is the structuring of the story. And it's a kind of underneath a whole load of set pieces and distractions and vignettes and asides, there is a kind of a race against time plot.
According to your theory, we have less than 48 hours before this All Saints' Day.
The story is, a journalist and a woman who works as a medium get together to go and fight the living dead in a town where a priest has hanged himself and there's opened the gates of hell.
If those gates are left open, it may be the end of humanity.
The idea is they have to get to Dunwich to try and close the gates of hell before, the world is destroyed.
No dead body will ever be able to rest in peace again.
You could build a fairly tense race against time plot around this idea.
And so the dead will rise up and take over the earth.
But what actually happens in City of the Living Dead is that we have set pieces that are allowed to blossom and develop so profoundly that you kind of almost forget about the whole race against time thing.
At midnight on Monday, we go into All Saints' Day. The night of the dead begins then.
It's about half an hour into the film before Christopher and Catriona actually speak to each other.
Where exactly is this city?
I don't know where it is. All I know is that it's called Dunwich.
And then the notion of racing to Dunwich to try and stop the gates of hell from opening sort of kicks into gear.
You've got to get to Dunwich. You must reclose those gates.
But even then we keep intercutting between that and these vignettes of supernatural occurrences in Dunwich.
I gotta go.
Well, wait, what about the...
Me too. Wait up, Mike. I'll see you around. So long.
No, wait. Mike, Roz!
And the vignettes are so strange and so prolonged that you almost forget where you are in the film.
Why do they have to make life so difficult?
I've seen this film, goodness knows how many times, more than 30, more than 40 times probably. That's a conservative estimate.
Bob! What's happened? Did you hurt yourself?
There are three main threads in the story. There's Peter and Mary and their race to Dunwich to try and stop what's happening. There's the story of Bob, his problems. And there's the travails and misfortunes of various Dunwich residents, which are dropped in as sort of vignettes throughout the story. This structure, in a way, reminds me of what James Herbert was doing in novels at the time. If you look at novels like The Rats and The Fog, which were written in the mid-70s, and I think probably hit Italy, as well, sold all over the world, I believe. James Herbert used to do this thing where he would have two central characters who were going to eventually try and save the day. And then he would zoom off to little side stories that were there purely to explore horrible events befalling characters that you've only just met. And this structure is it's a lovely structure for kind of creating very, very violent, very action-packed stories where there's a simple thread underlying it, but lots and lots of juicy vignettes of gruesome horror along the way. And that's what this film reminds me of to a great degree, except that the underlying thread is incredibly thin, so you can actually almost forget it's there. But if you think about the séance at the beginning, that takes up quite a lot of time and uses it very well. It's very, very potent and very well done. And then you've got the scene in the graveyard, getting Mary out of the coffin. That is allowed to play out for quite a long time as well. People who think that Lucio stampedes to the gore need to think again, because if you look at City of the Living Dead, it's a good half an hour before we get to the first really, really gruesome scene. I mean, it is very gruesome when we get there, but He's not stampeding there. There's a great deal of atmospheric build-up to that moment. Now, as far as Dardano Sacchetti was concerned, the principal influence on the writing, I think, was H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, Lovecraft is an influence on all these films that were made, this run of films that were made, City of the Living Dead, The Beyond, House by the Cemetery. They all have elements of Lovecraft involved. And also, in a way, the sense of an interlinking world where events from one film kind of seep into another. That's something that Lovecraft liked to do with his stories as well, with the Cthulhu mythos, where, you know, lots and lots of short stories written over several years would kind of dip in and have shared elements like a forbidden text that was mentioned in several stories. In City of the Living Dead, we get the Book of Enoch, or Enoch.
What's it again?
Enoch.
Yeah, Enoch.
Which is mentioned in The Evil Clergyman by H.P. Lovecraft. So this Book of Enoch isn't just a casual throwaway, it's actually like a little nod and a reference to Lovecraft directly.
According to you, this poor girl is dead because of a book that was written 4,000 years ago, correct?
That's right.
But the idea of a cursed text it's raised in City of the Living Dead. It plays a slightly bigger role in The Beyond, where you get the Book of Abon, which is a little bit more central to the story. I think perhaps one of the frustrating things, but also one of the additionally weird things about City of the Living Dead is it has lots of non sequiturs. The Book of Enoch seems like it's going to be a big deal.
Are you acquainted with the Book of Enoch? A text which dates back to more than 4,000 years ago. It contains man's first recorded description of his boundless mortal fear in the face of malice itself.
In a conventional script, the way that the medium, Teresa, talks about it at the beginning of the film would be a cue for a scene towards the end where the Book of Enoch was central to, I don't know, banishing the priest or whatever, you know. It's a bit like that, you know, the idea that if you, Chekhov's gun, you know, if you've got a gun in the first act, somebody's got to fire it in the third, you know. So this loaded mention of the Book of Enoch seems like it's going to be a pivotal plot detail, and then we never hear about it again. And all these films have got these kind of loose ends and stray, ragged sort of details that just, so I guess for people who like their stories to be very tidy and neat and everything to lock together with a satisfying sort of click, then that kind of thing probably drives them crazy, you know, because it's loose ends everywhere. But, well, A, life is full of loose ends, and B, for me, it just has this haunting sense of a path leading off that you don't go down. So it's a bit like being in a labyrinth, you know, for every path that you do take, there are lots of paths that you don't take. And the sense of the labyrinth as being bigger than your own choices is part of what makes it mesmerising and chilling, I think.
At this very precise moment, in some other distant town, horrendously awful things are happening. Things that would shatter your imagination.
There's another curious sort of non sequitur that occurs during the sequence with Teresa, the medium, in the aftermath of the séance when the police have arrived at the house. There's that great scene with the fire sort of just belching out of the ground and disappearing again.
Sergeant, come here and look!
Just strange, random, illogical occurrences like that, you know, just add extra sort of piquancy and detail to the film. There's another loose end as well, which is quite intriguing, which gets mentioned but never gets developed. In the sequence when Christopher George has rescued Catriona MacColl from being buried alive, and Christopher George says this really strange thing.
Listen, when Adrian De Niro told me about 2 years ago that I meet a girl who'd been buried alive, I didn't believe him either.
Someone called Adrian De Niro had told him that one day he would meet a woman who'd been buried alive, but he hadn't believed it.
I mean, I laughed right in his face.
So who's Adrian De Niro?
De Niro was aware of many things.
De Niro knew a great many things. He knew all about the City of the Dead.
He knew all about the City of the Dead.
So here's this kind of rather pregnant sort of exchange about some, you know, mystic who the lead character's already had contact with, and who apparently is, you know, a great source of knowledge and wisdom about these supernatural events. But again, we never hear anything more about him. At some point, Dardano Sacchetti put these details into the script. My guess is that in the very rapid turnover for this film, that it was a detail that got lost between the first and second drafts, and there simply wasn't time to do a tidy up and a clean up before it went into production. But what that does, again, for some people that's just going to be irritating, but for those of you who like a bit of a tantalising mystery and a question mark, then that just seems to add a little bit of weird backstory that you'd like to know more about.
I would find such an unusual paradox of tremendous appeal terribly stimulating.
Something else that only struck me recently about this film as well was that there's the idea that Peter and Mary have to get to Dunwich to close the gates of hell before All Saints' Day.
There isn't much time left. All Saints' Day begins at midnight.
All Saints' Day.
I'm not a religious person at all, so I mean, All Saints' Day kind of went over my head mostly, and it was only recently that I thought, oh, just see what that is. And it's November the 1st, which means that the scene in the cemetery towards the end of the film, when they arrive in Dunwich, and Catriona looks up at the tree, at the sky, which is getting dark. I think we're meant to believe it's midnight. She says, "Guess what? It's All Saints' Day." Well, therefore it's midnight, I suppose. Well, if All Saints' Day has just started and it's midnight of November the 1st, that means it's the night of October the 31st. So it's basically Halloween night. So depending on whether or not you think a day starts when you get up in the morning or a day starts at midnight, then, you know, essentially what we're talking about is that this film's set on Halloween. I mean, you know, Halloween itself takes place on Halloween night. I don't think anyone claims that it's actually set on All Saints' Day. So yes, it's a Halloween film.
The Lord help us.
Now, there are a lot of horror films coming out of Italy between about 79 and about 85, often very, very violent. Some of the most violent films ever produced in Europe, I think, were made during this period. You've got films like Cannibal Holocaust, House at the Edge of the Park, and the films of Lucio Fulci as well. So extreme visceral horror was very much in vogue at the time, largely, I think, through the success of Fulci's zombie flesh eaters. What's important, though, if you try to make a distinction between what Lucio did and what other directors did, is to try and bear in mind that there's a recipe here that's quite different to a lot of other directors. A lot of these films, like City of the Living Dead, like The Beyond, like House by the Cemetery, they have extreme visceral horror and disgust and repulsion on the one hand, and then you have very, very elegant camera work, very elegant art design, very beautiful painterly details in the photography and in the staging. And these elements really rub in a strange, interesting way against the brutality and the cruelty and the disgust on the other side of the equation. There's a tenderness in the handling of children in the films.
What's the matter, honey?
There's a sort of melancholy, there's a very strong underlying melancholy in the films, I think.
Calm down, dear. Take it easy. Calm down.
My baby. My poor baby.
These elements are not the same elements that are brought to play by, say, Marino Girolami when he goes and makes Zombie Holocaust. Not to knock Zombie Holocaust, which is a good laugh, but it's not really that kind of film. These elements, these extra elements, or rather, I should say, this combination of elements, is what makes the Fulci films special, and is what I think perhaps accounts for their longevity and the extra degree of fascination that they have maintained over the years. Catriona MacColl was interviewed some time ago and said, "I still don't really understand." I mean, she said, "I'm very glad that these films are appreciated as cult films. I still don't quite understand, after all these years, how come that they still seem to have this attraction." And I think really, for me at least, the explanation lies in this kind of unresolved tension between the elegance and the horror, the beauty and the ugliness. If you choose one route, then you head towards cliché. If you take two routes at the same time, if you take these two quite different components and try and bring them together, it's like alchemy. You kind of blend two things that normally don't go together and you make something different. And I think it's that special quality that comes from filming, I mean, a woman who vomits up her intestines in a film that's got moments like the rose petal falling from the rose inside the coffin, or the beautiful detail in the coffin when Mary's breath mists the mirror that's on the top of the coffin facing down. Little details like that, or the scene when the little boy's parents have been murdered and everyone goes to the house to try and save him, and you get a shot of blood dripping from a stain on the ceiling and it's landing in a glass of milk. And it's just this kind of precision of like this red drip down into this glass of milk for a story of a child. The symbolism is quite obvious. but as a very gentle, judicious detail, it just gives the films that little extra. They're not just concerned with practicality, these films, they're concerned with poetry as well. You know, sometimes they'll take a great deal of time to tell the story in a rather elliptical way so that you can go somewhere stranger and more unusual, rather than just cutting straight to the chase. Whilst we're talking about the macabre beauty of this film, I think we really need to think about the art designer on this film, a guy called Massimo Antonello Galeng. If you look at the scene when they go into the tomb towards the end of the film and they're underneath the cemetery and they're exploring these sort of catacombs with various corpses hanging down from the ceiling as if they're falling from the earth into which they were originally put, and we're now underneath the coffins, underneath the cemetery. That's my idea of beautiful. I think it's a beautiful piece of art design and a beautiful piece of photography. Sergio Salvati's photography is just incredible. I think the lighting is so beautiful. The whole conception, really, of that entire sequence. I remember, again, seeing this for the first time in the cinema and being totally, absolutely enthralled by that idea, you know, going beneath the cemetery and seeing the bodies hanging down above your head. I can't remember another film that's used that imagery. I mean, that's the only example I can think of. So just from the point of view of imagination and from the point of view of technical excellence as well, I think it's a really outstanding moment. And also Fabio Fritz's music at this point is incredible. There's some really quite atonal sort of feedback guitar and things, kind of weird scratching sound that's kind of really making you feel the tension of the characters as they have to crawl in between all these kind of rotted bodies. You know, I can talk until I'm blue in the face about how elegant and beautiful the film is, but at a certain point you have to stop talking about that and you have to just concentrate on the violence. And Lucio certainly knows how to do that. I think there are two scenes in particular. I mean, there's several gruesome scenes in this film, but there are two in particular that I think are just going to lodge in the minds of anyone who sees them. We've already talked a little bit about the gut barfing scene. It's worth just stopping and dwelling on this for a moment, though. I mean, Lucio certainly thought so. A priest who has risen from the grave, an evil priest with a malefic influence on the living, stares at a victim until her eyes bleed. She's rooted to the spot, can't move, and then at a certain point her mouth starts to froth. This horrible kind of red froth starts to come from her lips. And then a loop of intestine falls out of her mouth, and then another loop of intestine, and then a bit more intestine, and then rather a lot more intestine, and then suddenly like a large lump of something that must be a liver or just the stomach, I don't know. It becomes quite astonishing. I remember the first time I saw this and it was uncut in the British cinema release. I remember sitting in a cinema, I think it was in Leeds when I first saw it. I just couldn't believe my eyes. It's a real oh my God sort of sensation watching these scenes, because it starts and you think, oh, this is gross. Then you think, oh, he's taking it further. And then he's taking it even further. And you think, there's no one else doing this. He's turned what were just kind of sudden shock moments in horror into these great big production numbers, you know. And I think part of the appeal of the films is just the audacity, really, you know, and the defiant kind of relish with which he says, okay, this is a horror film. Get a load of this. So, you know, I think a lot of fans, this is one of the things I think where Fulci fans fall in love with Lucio Fulci and fall in love with his films. Because he doesn't care. He doesn't care about propriety. He doesn't care about whether or not you're going to lose your lunch. He just wants he wants to follow through on the contract that a horror filmmaker has with his audience and give you what so many other films don't, which is, you know, to really deliver on a scene of stomach-churning horror. So, if you've got any sense of wonder attached to a taste for the macabre and the morbid, then Lucio's your man. You know, these scenes really hit the target. And speaking of hitting the target, the next great big set piece, unforgettable set piece in the film is, of course, Bob and his date with Destiny on the end of a giant drill on a lathe. Now, this actually was cut out of the British cinema release. It's one of those cuts that happened, you know, the sort of cut that makes you groan when it happens. Or you knew exactly where that scene was going. Having seen zombie flesh eaters and the spike, the splinter that goes into the victim's eye in that film. This is sort of playing the same game, but with a drill instead of wooden splinter. It has a similar kind of build-up. It very cleverly in the editing makes sure that you know what the end point is going to be well before it happens. And then builds and builds and builds and pushes and pushes and pushes. Gives you plenty of time to think again, is he going to go there? Is he going to go there? Of course, in the BBFC version, he didn't. That wasn't his fault. In the real version, in Fulci's proper uncut version, he does. And my God, you know, that's a truly memorable attack on the human form. And he attracted a certain amount of mockery, I think, in fan circles or in critical circles. When he did an interview in the early 80s where he said that the drill scene was, I think the quote was, it was a cry that I wanted to launch about against a certain kind of fascism. And everyone just, I think there was a tendency to burst out laughing at this, like, oh, it's an anti-fascist statement, is it? I thought it was just a really, really nasty gore scene. But think about what he's saying and think about the characters. I know the characters aren't drawn with any great detail, but all the dialogue up to that point is indicating that Bob is an outcast. He's supposedly has gone into the woods with a girl from the village when she was underage.
It was Bob.
That pervert, you can bet on it. They should have put him away for life after what he tried to do with poor little Ann Ross.
And the implication is that he did something, or that he was going to do something, you know, he's going to rape her or something like that. But they stopped him before it got to that point. Well, in other words, he never did it. And the girl who he is supposed to have raped, or the girl who is supposed to have abducted and taken into the woods, is the same girl who comes and shares a joint with him in the back of the car.
Come on, smoke a little joint with me. Only then you better split, okay?
And it's her father that ends up killing him with the drill.
What are you doing? Get in the house, get!
I can explain everything, Mr. Ross!
Shut up, you bastard!
So, what this is really about is small-town paranoia and scapegoating.
And I wouldn't be surprised if he could tell us what happened to Rosie Kelvin. And Frank's kid, too.
He's a dropout, he's virtually the village idiot, you know, terrible communication skills, and he had the temerity to kind of go wandering into the woods, who knows for what, for a chat, we don't know, with a girl from the village, and the father assumed the worst. And now, with the terror rising in Dunwich, obviously the father is rattled by all these strange supernatural occurrences. He seems to have been driven over the edge.
What are you trying to do to my daughter? Huh?
Please let me explain, Mr. Ross. I was only looking for a place to sleep.
And his prejudgment of Bob takes over.
Pervert!
No!
Murderer!
No. No.
And he murders the kid. So this is kind of, you know, vigilante justice with no proof that there was ever a crime to avenge in the first place. So yeah, and it's maybe kind of tarting it up a little bit too much to say it's an anti-fascist statement, but really what it's about is, you know, small-town bigotry, small-mindedness and prejudice, and this kid who, you know, pays the ultimate price for it. Perhaps the ultimate loose end in a film that's got lots of loose ends and non sequiturs and elements that don't quite add up is the ending. I mean, the ending of the film leaves you on a sort of precipice and you don't really know quite what's going on. I think you have to understand that there was a problem in the editing with this film, and that the ending that we get for City of the Living Dead was created in the editing studio. There was a problem in as much as the written version didn't have a satisfactory ending, that the filming schedule hadn't allowed for something to be created during the filming. It was very much a last-ditch attempt to try and make something out of almost nothing. So the footage that was shot in the graveyard with Carlo Di Meo and Catriona MacColl and Luca Venantini, the little boy, it seems to be leading to some sort of terrible climax, that, like a sudden realization that they think they've emerged into the light of day, only to find that the horror hasn't been defeated after all. So it seems. But that impression of there being something ending on a downbeat note had to be created almost entirely in the editing studio. The editor, Vincenzo Tomasi, used various techniques like slowing down the image, almost moving to a stop with the images, very, very grainy and sort of slow. And then also adding this optical effect, basically the shattering optical effect over the last image of the film. It's not entirely satisfactory. It's a kind of a bit of a piecemeal effort to kind of find some way of leaving you on tenterhooks as a sort of unresolved ending. So the character's optimism that they've somehow defeated the malediction and survived to tell the tale turns out to be wrong, and the evil continues. So City of the Living Dead comes from one of the most popular eras of Fulci's career, and this film, along with a couple of others like The Beyond and House by the Cemetery, are pretty much the pinnacle of his work, I think. And also, certainly, they're the films which cemented him as a director that people actively sought out and wanted to see films by. Perhaps in his earlier career, he was not somebody necessarily that casual audiences were necessarily aware of, maybe not quite as conscious of the director. But these films attracted the attention of horror fans, and a very passionate fandom and cult built up around these films. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that people who love Lucio Fulci probably came to love him because they loved these films. And no matter how gruesome they are, no matter how violent and horrible they can be, it is love that you feel for these films. You really feel a strong affection for their provocation, for their extremity, for the fact that Lucio was just willing to go all out to give you the ultimate horror set piece.